heart hurts this morning. If the last several months of sheltering in place have not felt chaotic and disorganizing enough, there's additional disorganization and chaos of the last few weeks, which actually just of the last week, which began with the murder of George Floyd by a now former police officer. From there, we have had protests. Some of those protests have turned violent. But we know that it didn't begin then. This has been going on since 1619 in our country, or even before that. I am filled with sorrow, disappointment, and fear. Fear for what our country could become. Sorrow for the pandemic that is racism, police brutality, and white supremacy. Deep sorrow for every life, every person killed by police brutality and white supremacy. And I am also, because I am generally an optimistic person, filled with hope. We are blessed to live in this multi-connected world. So much of the narrative shaped by camera lenses and what is chosen to be shown on TV is not the full story. I have friends in the Minneapolis area who visited the sites of the protests yesterday morning, who cleaned up after looting, who worked to get food to people who needed it, who are working to make sure that people are safe, who are working to organize housing in retreat centers and cabins on lakes for people to get out of the Twin Cities to rest and recharge. There do appear to be white supremacists who are adding to the problems. It is overall a challenging and complex situation. We know that there is a danger in only hearing, seeing, or reading a single story. Chimamanda Adichie, in her phenomenal TED Talk, speaks about this. Growing up, she consumed, the media that she consumed featured white people who talked about the weather and who drank ginger beer. So when she started writing stories as a young girl in a country that I have forgotten in Africa, her stories were all about characters who were white, who talked about the weather and drank ginger beer, ignoring the fact that she didn't know what ginger beer was and the weather wasn't much to talk about. So look for other stories that are out there. We should not be surprised about white supremacy and racism. This concept that Black lives don't matter is baked into the apple pie that is our country. It has always been there. We are just now seeing it even more. Ibrahim X. Kendi, whose reading Susan read earlier, highlights this eloquently. It's not enough to say that you aren't racist. We must be actively anti-racist. Now, this doesn't mean that you or I will be perfect all the time. Indeed, we must put aside our notions of perfection, which prevent us from acting. Sent out some resources in the congregation-wide email last night that I encourage you to look at them. Or check out the Lawrence Public Library's Facebook page. They have a really great blog post that I shared with everybody in that email, a great local resource. What's sad is that I have gotten so used to adding this preface to my sermons. The number of times I have had to explain white supremacy and address that sickness is high in just 5 years of ministry. I doubt that I'll stop doing this, however, until we all remember that Black lives matter. So let's pause for just a moment while we switch gears, because this is my third to last sermon with you, by my count. So I have 2 stories for today about goodbyes. And sorry, Mom and Dad, they're about our stories together. From my perspective, I know yours might be different. My mom and dad join on Zoom. That's one of the great blessings of this technology. The first is about 15 years ago, and the other is about 3 months after that first story takes place. It was a few days after my last day of high school. We had all gathered for graduation rehearsal on the front lawn of the school to practice how to walk onto the outdoor stage, shake hands with the principal and the trustees, and then walk out again. We'd practiced walking on stage to Elgar's Pomp and Circumstance, and we were sitting on the stage when all of a sudden we see a state police car driving not quite at full speed, but pretty close, come to a screeching halt right next to the stage. The state trooper got out and whispered something to the principal, and she turned to us and said, "Head into the gymnasium now." And so we did. Now, we had come of age of a time of school shootings, of September 11th, and bomb threats, so we were all admittedly a little bit shaken. We gathered in the gym, and finally the principal shushed us all down and announced to us in her best imitation of the Boston accent that all state troopers seem to have or develop in the academy, "Get your people in your building, you got a bear on your yard." For those who don't speak Bostonian, he was saying that there was a brown bear that was roaming in the area around our building, and we had to get our graduating class into the building for our own safety. That haphazard nature of leaving proved useful later. 2 or 3 days after that was the actual graduation. It took place outside as we had prepared, but when we began, there was a slight chance of rain. And as they started to call the names of the graduates, the sky started getting darker until they got about 8 or 9 names from the end when thunder clapped and the skies let loose. So we all ran inside and went to the auditorium for about 10 minutes of chaos before they organized us all and finished handing out saying the names and handing out the diplomas. Then we walked out. Fast forward 3 months later. I'm off at college orientation, which my parents came to for the first day. We had a nice catered dinner a ways off campus as a goodbye dinner. And after I finished my dinner and threw away the plate, I announced to my parents, "Well, I'm going to go back to my dorm. Bye." And we hugged, and I walked back alone to undergo the rest of college orientation. Several years ago, when I told this story again, my parents remarked, and I'm quoting from memory here, so it could be wrong, "You know, you need to tell our side of the story. We hated that goodbye. We wanted to walk you back to your dorm and hug and say goodbye." I think I explained that at the time. Well, I knew that I was going to be back home the next weekend, like 4 days from then, and it was only a 45-minute drive or an hour-long train ride. The response was something like, "Yeah, we know, but it was a big rite of passage for us." What did I learn from these experiences? The first is rehearse and prepare for those liminal moments, but know that what you plan will likely get changed. Sometimes you practice exactly what you need to do. Finally, communicate what is necessary for you to have happen in that goodbye, and communicate what you need to say. Know that goodbyes are tough for everyone. It's hopefully no surprise to you that on this Zoom call that my time with you is drawing to a close. This has always been the agreement. My contract would run from September 15th, 2018 to July 31st, 2020, with the vacations that our contract provides in there. This means that I only have 3 or 4 more Sundays with you. And so we need to consider, how will we say goodbye to one another? It doesn't make it any more challenging. We talk about how to say goodbye because each goodbye prepares us for the following one. On August 1st, I will no longer be your minister. Perhaps by now you have come to terms with that. Perhaps this month long of saying goodbyes seems drawn out. But then when it happens, it seems sudden. Being in contact with someone is never something you can slowly dial back and then it's gone. You look over your shoulder as they disappear into the horizon. One moment they are there, and then the next moment they're gone. The moment that a relationship, a friendship, a partnership ends happens in a split second, but it's the lead up and the aftermath after it that lingers. I like, therefore, what Yahya Lababidi says in that poem. It talks about the lead up to that moment of leaving, and then that moment of leaving. Something will stretch, the poet writes, croak or come undone, so that everything else must be reconsidered. There are moments when everything creaks, when chairs shift their arms and tables, their legs and closets crack their backs incautiously. Some piece of immobility will finally quit, suddenly nimble on wooden limbs as fast as a horse fleeing the stable. You can surely think back to your own goodbyes that you have had to make in this life. Goodbye to people because you have moved homes or they moved a home, ended a relationship, switched jobs, or because of death or other reasons. Goodbyes are so challenging because human beings are wired to be in connection. And so a loss of connection worries us. When we get to the point of saying goodbye and farewell, I think there are two ways most people approach a goodbye. They either try to run through the thistles or they take their time. Roy Oswald, who's a noted scholar of church leadership, wrote it this way. When I was a young boy, he writes, age 6, growing up in rural Saskatchewan, my 2 older brothers and I would often decide to walk home from school over the fields rather than along the road. It was shorter, to be sure, but occasionally we would come up against enormous thistle patches. I cannot remember seeing anything like it since, but those thistle patches sometimes used to extend for a half a mile or more. In the prickly patches, which would be 50 to 100 feet wide, in other places 10 to 20 feet wide, the rest of the field laying fallow in summer was tilled soil. Now, we rarely wore shoes to school in the summertime, hence our dilemma. How to cross this thistle patch in bare feet? We did have the choice of walking around them, but since it was the end of the day, we were all tired and hungry. We were anxious to get home. He continues on to say Mother would usually have a snack for us to tide us over until supper. To walk around the patch would take us out of our way. The other option was to back up and run through the narrowest part at full speed. Being the youngest, Roy Oswald writes, with the least speed and the smallest leg span, I always objected. I was always overruled, however, by my 2 other brothers, who would each then take me by one hand and run me through the thistle patch. I can still vividly remember the experience, running full speed in bare feet across 20 feet of prickly thistles, yelping in pain all the way. When the 3 of us reached the black soil on the other side, we would immediately hit the dirt and start pulling out the few thistle branches in our feet. I had 4 briars. Get me? How many did you get? Was a sample of our post-agony conversation. How many goodbyes have you ever rushed through simply because you knew it would be painful? How many goodbyes have you ever had that were far too quick? Or goodbyes where only one party, yourself, was able to say goodbye because the relationship ended on terms not your own? There was a book published back in 2004 by Ira Bjork called The 4 Things That Matter Most. In this book, he lays out 11 words which can help mend relationships. They are, please forgive me, I forgive you, thank you, and I love you. Bjork worked mainly in palliative care and hospice situations, and because of that, much of what he writes about is from the perspective of final goodbye. Goodbyes are emotional, especially because in those sort of situations, because it's the final one, our last chance at potentially mending relationships. We know that in any relationship, partnership, or friendship, if it is as most human relationships are, people fumble with words. They say hurtful things, intentionally or unintentionally, or are clumsy with our relationships. This is why I think that saying, please forgive me, is the important first set of words. When saying goodbye, it is important to recognize the way in which a relationship could have been better, to recognize the very human parts of where a relationship might have failed to live up to our highest ideals. I forgive you is also important. It's a recognition that you know that there are times when the other person has come up short. Maybe not because they have sinned, because that seems like very strong language, but at least you recognize that there are times when the other person missed the mark. Of course, I recognize that there are times when the other person has done egregious things, such as abuse or neglect, all of which make forgiving tough. But I think in some way we can forgive, which is very different from forget. Thank you is the next phrase that one needs to say. I think it was Meister Eckhart who said, if the only prayer you ever say in your life is thank you, it will be enough. I don't want to dwell on this part too long because talking about gratitude comes in a few weeks. But letting the other person know that you are glad that they were in your life is so crucial. It can help them realize the impact they had on your life. And I love you is the final phrase. And that second word, love, we know that it can have a lot of different meanings. The Greeks had several words for agape, a more sort of divine love, is a compassionate love. Brotherly philia is a brotherly love or friendship. Storge is a familial love, a kind of affection based on nature or instinct. And eros is erotic or romantic. Those different types of love cover any sort of I love you statement you might want to make while saying goodbye. Please forgive me, forgive you, thank you, and I love you. There's a final phrase that is important, maybe more important than all of those other phrases combined, and that's goodbye. Goodbye comes from a contraction of the phrase, God be with ye. I recognize that for some, God isn't a useful concept in your life. That's fine. Chances are good I don't believe in that God that you don't believe in either. The mystery beyond all understanding, in my eyes, provides presence, not protection. So I suppose you could add an extra O to that and you've got good. That works too. Goodbye is a benediction, a blessing, a hope that the greater good will follow you all the days of your life. So my friends gathered here, this isn't goodbye quite yet. We still have a number of months left to go in this partnership that we have together. But as my time does draw to a close, please forgive me, I forgive you, thank you, and yes, I love you. May it be so.